Welcome to the Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. This podcast is designed to provide momentum in our God-given roles of leadership as we partner together to equip today's Christian leaders for tomorrow's opportunities. Whether you're a pastor, youth leader, ministry volunteer, parent, or student, we want to be your go-to and most trusted resource for equipping and encouragement when it comes to your ministry and leadership influence. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. My name's Eric Miller and I am your host. And today we have with us Dr. Juli Slattery. I always think like when I say it that way, people will cheer and clap, but then I forget it's a podcast.
That's right. They don't clap anyway.
Someone somewhere in their car is clapping right now as they're listening. I don't think so either. All right, Juli, you are welcome back. So you're not a newcomer to the podcast. Mm-hmm. You were on season 1. So if you're interested and you know of Juli, go back to season 1, episode 24 and 25. We had to do a two-parter because you had so much wonderful knowledge and insight to give us. We talked about the purity culture and the pendulum of what goes on in our world and our churches. That was an amazing episode. I actually, Juli, I don't know if you know this, but I tell a ton of youth pastors about the episode and send them back to that. And so that one is one of our top-rated podcast or most listened to or downloaded. I don't know all the words, but thank you for that. So there's some good truth. Yeah. So Juli, you've been here. We're obviously in a different setting. Mm-hmm. We're at Momentum Youth Conference this week. For those watching on YouTube, you'll see students buzzing around behind us. They're waiting patiently in the lunch line, and they'll probably be waving at us and trying to distract us, but we're going to engage in a conversation.
That sounds good. I feel like we're on like one of those morning news shows.
There you go.
You got the people in the background.
Yeah, they actually have signs that are out here, but it's really just to color code and get people quickly through the lunch line. It's not to be on this, so I love it. Juli, share a little bit about like what's our goal for having you here. We've talked a lot. We've gotten to know each other. It's been fun to just have you here, but we specifically asked you to come add value to our youth leaders. And we want to kind of continue that in this conversation. But what are some of the resources that you've been sharing with the youth workers here? Kind of give us the direction, the topics that you're talking them through, and what does that look like?
Sure. So you know, Eric, that I started a ministry about 11 years ago called Authentic Intimacy. And it's all about godly sexuality, like integrating the Lordship of Jesus Christ into sexuality. And so I feel like God kind of just gave me a running start on some of the conversations that we need to have today.
Yeah.
And youth leaders among all church staff are the ones who are the most aware of the need to shift how we're talking about sexuality. So whenever I go and I talk to a church staff, usually a senior pastor is somewhat aware of it, but the youth leader's like, I'm swimming in this. Every day, this is my life. And it's the LGBT conversation, it's pornography, it's sexting, it's masturbation, it's all the issues that adults are dealing with too, but the youth are bringing forward.
Yep.
And so my purpose here today is over the last 11 years really having learned some of what we have done not so well in the church over the last couple decades, and how we need to shift those conversations, just sharing that with these youth leaders and equipping them with some tools of how they disciple their students in the area of sexuality.
Yeah. I love it because not only are you like sharing your experiences and what you've seen and the things that God has given you and put on your heart, but also you wear like multiple hats. So you've written books on these things. You have a lot of books out. Rethinking Sexuality is probably my personal favorite one. I recommend that all the time to pastors. We've given it out at our Momentum Pro cohorts. But you have the clinical psychologist background, so you add that mindset. But you're also a mom, and so like your boys are now out of the house.
Yes,
you've walked them through this path. You've had those conversations. So like, as you wear all these different hats and you think about all those things, how did some of these resources come about? And then where can people find those? How can they get a hold of you and connect with you to get some of those resources?
Yeah, Erica, I think some of it's just how God wired me. I'm one of those kind of deep thinkers that likes to be alone and sort through things. And so just over the years of practice in clinical psychology, being a wife, being a mom, having grown up in the church, and then also dealing on a daily basis with all of these issues related to sexuality, I just kind of go away, do a lot of thinking, do a lot of praying, a lot of reading, and then sort of crystallize, all right, like, how do we walk in today's world with a deeper understanding of God's design for our sexuality? So a lot of it really is how I'm wired. And so what we do at our ministry is we create resources both for like just the normal person who's like, hey, help me with my marriage, help me with my sexual struggles. And those are found at our website, AuthenticIntimacy.com. We have a podcast called Java with Julie. And we've been doing that for 10 years, which is crazy. But we just have very honest, open conversations about everything related to sexuality. So that's an easy way to jump in. Books, Bible studies, seminars, and then we also have our leader training, which is our sexual discipleship website. So, and Eric, that's where I really feel like God calling me in these days is equipping leaders, pastors, counselors, missionaries, and just sharing with them what God has shown me over the years.
Yeah. It's been fun just even for us as we've gotten to know you over the last 3 years, and for Momentum to partner with Authentic Intimacy and you to like, for me personally, to benefit from the podcast. Bethany, my wife, and I, we listen often to the Java with Julie. I apologize, we don't have coffee here.
That's all right. I just had some before I got here, so I'm wired.
I got cut off earlier. They told me I was too wired.
Oh, really?
So but the benefit of that is so significant because you are developing resources that matter and have a huge impact in our culture today. And not just for pastors, not just for the leaders, not just for parents, but also for the students who are getting eaten alive in this culture today with sexuality, with wrestling with their identity, with all the things that you just mentioned. And so many times they don't know where to go with that.
Right.
They don't know what to do with those things. So thank you for that. As a pastor myself, your newest book, God, Sex, and Our Marriage, is so good. And if you're listening to this, I would strongly recommend go to Amazon right now and buy that book and get the curriculum that goes with it, because those materials are life-changing if you go through them and you use them in such a way. Bethany and I have been recipients of that. We've actually got to sit in your basement and do that with you and Mike. And so that's amazing to get to have like people that are investing, but the tools, the resources to help understand biblically how God's wired us, how we can overcome some of these things. So, Julie, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for that encouragement.
Yeah. All right. So for our students who might be tuning into this episode, because you got to speak main stage, we did an interview together. We talked about some of the things that, some of these very topics and resources that are available to our students. So I'm trusting that probably some of them are listening to this right now. What are some of the episodes of the Java with Julie podcast maybe that you would point them to? What are resources maybe that students could even go to the website and check out that could be for them as well?
Yeah, so some of the Java with Julie episodes, believe it or not, traveling the country, the number one question I always get asked is masturbation.
Yep.
So I get asked questions everywhere.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it's like
Yes.
I just anticipate it. So
Yes.
so that is actually, I think, our number one downloaded podcast episode as well, and there's some blogs on that on that topic, and then just lots of episodes about gender identity, about sexuality, lots of great guests. Jackie Hill Perry, Sean McDowell, I think, is on this week.
Fun.
Just every issue you can imagine. But I think what's unique maybe about the way that we address the topic, Eric, is there's less focus on behavior and more focus on surrender.
Amen.
So we're not going to change our behavior until we change our thinking.
Yeah.
And we are so inundated with the world's way of thinking about sex. And I think that's true even of us, of adults who are married. We still think about sex wrong. And until we really get our thinking turned around and more biblically rooted, we're going to have a really hard time changing behavior. So my heart
Yeah.
for students is really helping them identify the cultural messages that they've just kind of digested whole.
Yep.
And challenge those.
Yes.
Instead of just focusing on stopping behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go into that a little bit
Sure.
deeper, because I think the primary audience of this episode, or the podcast in general, is pastors and parents.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say, like, the thing that we need to wrap our heads around as married couples, as adults, is the context of our marriage. What do you mean by that? Expound on that idea.
Yeah, so, for example, a cultural assumption that we live with today is that you cannot be a fulfilled person if you don't have romantic attachment and sexual expression. And I think what the church has done, instead of challenging that assumption, we've Christianized it. And we've said, okay, you can find fulfillment by saving sex for marriage and then someday getting married and having that romantic attachment and sexual fulfillment.
Right.
And when we look at Scripture, the Bible actually doesn't say that human flourishing comes primarily through romantic relationship and sexual expression. Now, it highly values marriage, but not as a mile marker for Christian maturity. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul would say that it's possible to even be more surrendered to Christ and a more mature Christian if you don't get married. And so that's an example of a cultural assumption that instead of challenging that assumption, we're actually just trying to Christianize it. And that has all kinds of ramifications. Like, for example, the same-sex attracted Christian who feels like, well, I can't have romantic attachment and sexual fulfillment, so God must be unloving if he's letting you have this stuff, but I can't have it. Or even just the married Christian couple who is finding that marriage isn't super satisfying and it's more challenging than it is life-giving,
Right.
even in the sexual relationship. If their assumption is that this was supposed to be God's goodness and fulfillment for me, and now I'm not experiencing that, then did I marry the wrong person?
Yeah.
So when we push on those assumptions and actually go back to the gospel of what it means to give our life to Christ and what fullness of life looks like when I'm dead to self and alive in Christ, we find that marriage and sexual fulfillment now, they're not bad things, but they become less critical things.
Right.
And so that would just be one example of how our wrong thinking about sexuality is skewing our behavior even as we steward it as married or single people.
Yeah. Where do you think that comes from, Julie? Like, I know for many of us, it's probably modeled from our parents. For some of us, maybe it's culture, maybe it's a combination of those things. But like, how are you seeing that in your years of experience and counseling people and thinking through curriculum? What are those factors that play into that mindset? And then how do you shift back out of that? Can you give like a practical tip or two to like shift your thinking there?
Yeah, so Eric, one of the things we need to realize is that these assumptions are so embedded in our culture that it goes back centuries. So, for example, Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, tracks hundreds of years of the romantic writers and of political movements and how that's all brought us to this time where the most important thing about me is what I feel and my longings. And so when you try to tease that out, Nancy Pearcey's book, Love Thy Body, is another good one that looks at the historical context of how we got here. And when you understand that it's taken hundreds of years to get to the point where Westerners think the way we think, you realize that there's not a quick solution. But when we do look at practical solutions, I think it starts by realizing that we need to challenge cultural assumptions. And thinking biblically is not just about looking at the Bible of the things that are prohibited sexually. It's looking more deeply at the story of sex in the Bible and what priority does God put on gender and sexuality and what is the purpose of it and the context for it. And so when Paul says in Romans chapter 12, we're transformed by the renewing of our minds, it's literally turning the philosophies and assumptions that we've digested on its ear and thinking differently so that we can then live differently.
So for pastors maybe who are listening to this and they're like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But they don't know how to engage maybe their church, their congregation. Maybe it's a student pastor and they're like, I'd love to engage my students in that, but they're not like ready for marriage yet.
Yeah.
how do we help them like in that process? You obviously have resources that will help towards that. That's part of the reason we brought you here for the week at Youth Conference. Give some like next steps that they can take in that process to open that dialogue in their congregations or student ministries.
Right. And you use the phrase, they're not ready for marriage yet. And I would just say every kid is ready for these conversations, because it's not just marriage. It's what do I do with my desires, and how do I navigate the gender conversation? So we're seeing the need for this discipleship to start even at the ages of your kids, because you're laying the foundation of how to think through gender and sexuality. So that's also why I said, Eric, that I'm most excited about our sexual discipleship platform, and a lot of my time is going towards developing resources for leaders so that you can feel equipped to disciple. And it really is a discipleship journey. It's again, us first learning to think differently about sex, and then learning a vocabulary that we can then use in our one-on-one conversations with the students and kids that we interact with. We actually, you don't even know this, but we just hired a pastor full-time to come on to staff and to work with pastors and integrating this work into their church culture and in their youth groups and marriage groups and things like that.
That's amazing. That's amazing. To our listeners, if you're not signed up for the Authentic Intimacy newsletter, go to the website, get that, because you guys you do a great job of sending out resources, inviting people into some of these conversations, training, equipping, things like that are available. And as more are coming out, blog articles, updated podcast episodes that are aimed towards that, they're super helpful. So I want desperately to make our listeners aware of these, because these are valuable resources and tools that you can use for the success of shepherding your people, helping engage in that conversation with your children. So let's go that way for put your mom hat on.
All right, I got it on.
You never take it off, I hear.
Yeah.
Dads can take that hat on and
That's
off, but moms can't. So with your boys, how did you, kind of speak to our parents listening here, how do you, some people would look at you and they'll say, of course it's easy for you to talk to your kids about it. You offered books and you've written curriculum, and they look at pastors and they're like, of course you talk to your kids about sex and pornography and masturbation. You're the pastor. You have a biblical education. But for the parents that they're like, I don't have that, help them overcome that fear. And what questions could they ask? How can they kind of engage in this conversation? I know it's not a one-time thing. It needs to be ongoing. So let's get that out of the way. What pointers would you give?
Let me just throw out a few caveats first. First of all, I'm on a learning journey. And so my youngest son is 20. My oldest son is 26. And so when I go back 10 years ago when I started this ministry, they were like young teenagers. And I think even for my oldest, he would have been 15 or 14 when I started Authentic Intimacy. I wish I could have that time back, because I'm learning alongside everybody else. And I look at the conversations I had with my youngest son, and they were much more open and honest because I learned. Now, I'll also say that today's parents are facing challenges and conversations that I wasn't facing 5 years ago. And the transgender conversation, just the acceptance of everything in the LGBT spectrum, everybody grows up now with an iPhone, an iPad, and so the exposure to pornography is even greater than it was 5 years ago. So I'm not going to be like, well, when I had kids, it's a challenge. But I think, Eric, the first step is we need to be disciplined in our sexuality. And so if I'm not comfortable talking about it, if I still have shame about things from my past, or I'm still using a purity paradigm in my thinking, I'm going to be really stilted in communicating something different to my kids. So I have a real heart for working with the parents first, so that discipleship is this overflow of your life onto your kids' life. And one thing I say is we can't take our kids further than we've gone ourselves. And so there's a real need, I think, for us as adults and pastors and Christian leaders to say, all right, Lord, what do you want to do in my heart first? Because that's when these conversations become natural and shame-free, and they become gospel-centered.
That's really good, Julie. I want to highlight a couple of things that you said there, like, and if I may, like, one of my favorite phrases is like, if you want to be a leader, you've got to be a reader, right? So there, in the coaching with youth pastors that I do all the time, I'm telling them, like, I don't know is an okay answer to give, but you can't stay there. Help them process. And so find these books, read, study, learn, grow. So I love what you're saying there, because I think there are times where in culture, and maybe even from that parent or that pastor perspective, we get stuck in that place. And I think the enemy's like happy about that.
Yeah.
We're like, well, there's this fear and we don't know what to do, and we say we don't know, and so then we just get stuck there, and it's easier then to just not address it or not ask the questions or not engage in the conversation. And yet you're exactly right. Like, these students do need to be engaging in these conversations. I would argue they actually are engaging in these conversations on social media and with their friends, unbeknownst to many of us as adults.
Right. So true. Yeah. And in some ways, our kids can teach us, because they're much less hesitant to talk about sexuality, and they can help us understand what's happening with their friends and in their school culture, because it's different than when we were in high school or college. And so I think asking a lot of questions, listening is good. But I'd also say that be on a learning journey yourself. So on Java with Julie, Eric, 95% of the time I interview experts.
Yep.
And so that's where I learn. So I get to learn from people like Jackie Hill Perry and Preston Sprinkle, and from Mark Yarhouse, and from Pure Desires, Nick Stumbo, and like the leaders in some of these conversations around sexuality, Dan Allender, all the different pieces of what wholeness and healing look like. So always be curious. Don't be afraid to say, hey, I'm learning too.
That's good.
We all are, because the questions are changing. And so we need to consistently be looking to God's word and the people he raises up to address what's happening in our world.
What would be some of those questions then that you'd recommend that can begin that conversation as a pastor, as a parent, that might help a student to open up, to share, to give feedback and perspective on that?
Yeah, I think even just saying, hey, like, high school for you is different than high school was for me. Tell me what it's like for you. What conversations happen around sexuality? And just see what they say. A lot of kids are really waiting to talk to their parents about these things. What's it like for you to navigate that? Tell me what it's like. I'm not in your school.
Yeah.
Like, when I was in school, the biggest thing we were worried about was, kids making out in the parking lot. It's different today.
Yep.
So some things like that. And then I think getting at the deeper level, some of the questions we need to be asking is, why do you think we're seeing such a shift in how we understand sex and gender?
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that? And just see what your kids say. And they'll probably ask you back.
Yeah.
And even, why do you think that sex matters to God? What do you think is the purpose of our sexuality? So again, these are questions that cause a student or even an adult to think more deeply instead of just memorizing a list of rules of do's and don'ts.
I love it. Those are really good, Julie. Thank you for those. All right, one last question, kind of to help think through. I'm trying to think, like, from our listener perspective, like, again, for a student, maybe for a young adult that they're single. I actually didn't meet my wife until I was 31. So I was a pastor for about 10 years as a single person. And the church, if we're honest, doesn't always do a good job of, like, allowing you to be single and whole and complete, and understanding that that's okay.
Yeah.
Or like what you quoted with Paul earlier, like, I think we forget about those verses sometimes.
Yeah.
Like, and I got to experience that, but I've talked to a lot of students that they're like, we don't want to date. We want to be single. We want to have friends. We want to, like, live in community. And I think sometimes their perspective on that is healthier than ours when we were in high school, or like back in the day. Like, there's this pressure sometimes in our churches even to date, to find your spouse. How do you help encourage people that are single and they're wanting to be in ministry and they're seeing God use them, but they feel like it's not enough by other people? There's that pressure there.
Yeah, that I'd say, Eric, that's like one of the subjects I've really learned so much about from people like Sam Alberry, who is a single pastor and talks a lot about singleness, and just people in my own life, that we really have kind of propagated this narrative that to be a mature Christian, you have to be married, or even to be a pastor, you have to be married.
Right.
And so I think some of it is even nuancing our language from the pulpit, not making every example a marriage example or a parenting example, but use examples of a 35, 45-year-old single person, whether it's somebody who's never been married or divorced or widowed. Like the research would show, particularly with females, that over 50% of your adult population are single or single again. And so take that into account and make that a normal part of your conversation and teaching. I think also having role models. So people on your pastoral staff who are single and living just a beautiful single life, letting them share their testimonies of what that's looked like for them. And then I think, and I've learned this even in my own parenting, I used to say, well, when you get married, and now I don't say that, I say, if you get married. And even when I pray for my boys, I used to pray, Lord, bring them, you know, a wife that will help draw them closer to you. Now I'm like, Lord, if they are to get married, if you would bring them. And so I think it's just a shift of, even when we think of our own children, not to assume that marriage is going to be part of God's will for them. Now, I do think it's really important to talk to kids and adults about our need for intimacy. And we can live without sex, but we can't live without intimacy. And you never want somebody to choose not to get married because they're afraid of intimacy. You want them to not get married because their life is so full with intimacy with God and the family of God and the work that He's given them that they don't feel like that's even needed. So I think those sort of paradigm shifts are big. I'll also say that we have an awful lot of young women, middle-aged women that would love to get married, but there's just not available Christian men. Particularly within some ethnic communities, the African American community, there's so many single women who would love to get married. And every time you talk about the fulfillment of all this being marriage, it's like a knife in their chest, because they're like, that's probably never going to happen for me.
Wow. So how then, okay, my brain's racing now because you're giving us so much good stuff here. I love it. Thank you. In that, help separate when you say intimacy from relationships and marriage and dating. For students, for people who are in that, how do you do that? What does that look like? Break that out, define those terms a little bit.
It's a good question, Eric, because a lot of people don't know how to think about intimacy apart from sexuality. But I think the best thing to do is to use examples. So I would dare say that I have an intimate relationship with each of my 3 sons. Now, obviously, there's nothing sexual about it, but I know them. I love them deeply. They know me. We share life together. We talk about deep things. We're connected. I have an intimate relationship with my mom, who's 83 years old. Again, we've lived a lot of life together. We're committed to each other. So it's thinking in terms of, wow, what is a close relationship where there's commitment, where there's a history of knowing each other, where trust has been built. When we read Paul's letters, like some of the things he says to his co-workers and to these churches are so intimate. Like crying over them and how parting is difficult and how deeply he loves them. And every time I think of you, I thank God for you and I'm praying for you. Like that's language of intimacy. And so I think rather than using words to define it, I think seeing pictures that describe it really resonate with us.
That's really good. I like thinking in those picture sense of like, I even yesterday was having a conversation with a guy. He's like, I'm same-sex attracted. It's a struggle I've had all my life. God's calling me to be. He obviously loves Jesus and wants to pursue Him. He's here at our youth conference. He's like, I want to have influence in my community and point people to the Lord, but that's a battle. And he's like, it's hard to have. He goes, sometimes in our culture, we misconstrue having close personal friends with sexuality and this whole like intimate relationship that we then think to mean something totally different than it's not.
Yeah.
So thank you for helping define those terms. That's a big deal. I think it's challenging even in student culture in our world right now, where students are seeing like, you're my best friend.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing these guys and girls that are like, they're forming that intimate relationship, and there's health there, there's innocence there. It's wonderful. I think God's pleased with that. But then the world looks at that and taints it and distorts it and projects something that it isn't.
Yes.
And saying like, oh, you must be a lesbian. Oh,
Right.
you must be gay. Oh, you must. And then when you get told that so many times by culture, the world, and when the LGBTQ community is so open and accepting of all those things, and they're hurting and longing for that intimacy and the connection and community, I'm like, well, of course that's a challenge and something that we wrestle with.
Right.
Do you agree with all that? Are you seeing this?
Yeah, Eric, I think for some kids, they only need to be told that one time, and they start to have a doubt that the enemy will just repeat again and again. And I also think, when you look at the way relationships form, for the vast majority of young women, their first emotional attachment is going to be another girl or another young woman, like a role model, you know? And if the only category they have for that is that must be sexual, how damaging that is. And the same is true with young men. Their first emotional connection, peer to peer, is likely going to be another guy who gets them, who they can share with. That's appropriate. But again, if they have no category for intimacy and connection and deep feeling apart from it being sexualized, then there's going to be rampant confusion, which is what we're seeing today. I think there was a study that just came out last week that in a major Ivy League university, 40% of the students identify as LGBT.
Wow.
40%.
Wow.
And historically, we've seen numbers closer to 3%. And so when you introduce this confusion and you don't give any category for intimacy apart from sexualization, you just have a whole generation who's walking around confused.
Wow. Well, Julie, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation with all of us. Thank you for being here at Youth Conference and helping to invest in our leaders. They're enjoying it. Several of them have come up to me and said, like, when can we hear more of Julie? And like, this is a tremendous value add and a benefit. So thank you for partnering with us. I'm excited to go and listen to the Sean McDowell episode on Java with Julie, because he's been a longtime partner of Momentum and has spoke at our youth conference for a long time. And so he's a good guy. And Jackie Hill Perry's been here too. So it's fun, the partnerships and the circles and connections. And thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
for what you do, Eric.
Yeah, it's fun. Well, that'll conclude today's episode. If you haven't yet rated, reviewed, subscribed to this conversation, we'd love for you to do that so that you can be in the loop about all of our upcoming episodes and topics that we're doing. If you ever have any questions that you'd like for us to ask on a Momentum Ministry Partner podcast, then please send those to us. You can do that at info@buildmomentum.org, and we'd be happy to include those on an upcoming episode. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. We hope you found it to be valuable. And if you did, would you share it with someone else in your network who might enjoy it? Also, would you please go on and subscribe, rate, and review it? That way you don't miss any more, and somebody else will be able to find it too. Also, because we want to be your trusted resource, if you have a question or topic that you would like us to discuss on an upcoming episode, send that to us via email to info@buildmomentum.org, or you can send us a DM on any of our social media platforms. You can find us there at Momentum Ministry Partners. Also, if you need more information on our ministry, be sure to check out our website at buildmomentum.org. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you next time.